Jared, would you lead our prayer this morning?
Our God and Father, we come before you this morning thanking you for an opportunity that we have to gather with family here at Byron Street to study your word, to grow closer together as a family, to learn how to properly live our life in accordance with your word. We're so thankful for the great news of Miss Rice. We're thankful for Miss Mary being able to be home. We ask a special prayer for her and Mr. Ed. Lord, we ask that you please be with the Duns and the trials that they're facing at this time. Please help us all this morning to cast aside the cares of this world and help us to focus on while we are here. Please let your light shine through us. And may all that we do here this morning be done in your, pleasing in your sight. In Christ's name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Matthew 27 and verse 54, we find a very interesting scene that takes place immediately following the death of Jesus. Where we left off last week, Jesus cried out, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And we talked about how the peace that came over him as he was able to depart from this life. But immediately when he breathed his last, when his heart stopped beating and that physical life ended, some miraculous things happened, and we talked about that. An earthquake that was so strong that it did not crumble the rocks, but it literally tore the rocks in two. This earthquake also, as all this was going on, the veil of the temple, we talked about the sheer dimensions of that, how it was so large and so heavy that it took 300 men just to hang this curtain, this veil. And it was torn in half. And I shared with you how some of the historians had talked about the fact that 2 teams of horses would not have been strong enough to rip this veil, indicating just how strong this piece of material was. And I talked about how it was 70-something different squares of material, and we just showing that this had to be something miraculous, that this was not something that could have happened just by happenstance. It's not something that could have happened by a couple of men going in there and doing it to make people think, yeah, this is a sign that Jesus is the Son of God. No, this was something miraculous. And then we left off talking about those saints, those who had been faithful to God, who had departed from this life prior to the death of Jesus. The text says they came back to life. The graves were opened, the tombs were opened. They came back to life. But they did not leave the tombs and go into the city until after the resurrection of Jesus. And we talked about some of the reasons why I believe that was. But now we come to Matthew 27. And this one verse is one that I believe has a very powerful lesson for us to learn. In fact, I have a sermon, and I think I've preached it here, that I entitled "The Man Who Crucified Jesus." And I talk about this centurion who was there standing guard. He would have been the chief executioner, the one making sure everything was carried out in an appropriate fashion. Well, notice verse 54. Now when the centurion and they that were with him, this would have been talking about the other soldiers, the other executioners that were there, watching Jesus, saw the earthquake and those things that were done, meaning all of these miraculous things that were going on, when they saw these things transpiring at the moment that Jesus appeared to have died. The text goes on to say, they feared greatly. Folks, this was something that had never happened before when they saw someone die. And they likely had been there and had carried out hundreds of executions at this point. But nothing like this had ever happened. They got afraid. They were terrified at what they saw taking place. And notice this, they feared greatly, saying, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Now, what's the significance of this? Well, this centurion and the men serving under him, these were Roman soldiers. These weren't Jews. These were Roman idol worshippers. People that had no faith in Jesus whatsoever. People who had no faith in the God of heaven. But what they saw, they could not deny. There was no way to explain this away. This had to be the power of God. This had to be a miracle. But something else that's interesting to me, and in reference to this, I found a statement from Brother Burton Kaufman. And he made this statement. He said, practically all beings who came into contact with Jesus in some way and at some time confessed who He was. Now, let me add to that. Sometimes they may not have been sincere in that confession, but at one time or another, just about every person He came into contact with acknowledged, either in faithfulness or in jest, that Jesus was the Son of God. You know, we think about the angels confessing Him at His birth in Luke 2 and verse 11. We see the demons confessing Him in Matthew 8 and verse 29. We find God confessing Him 3 times. This is my beloved Son. We see this at His baptism. We see this on the Mount of Transfiguration. And then we also see this in John 12 and verse 28, where it describes a voice like thunder coming out of heaven, confessing Jesus as His Son. We see these 2 older individuals that were there in the temple keeping watch for the coming of the Messiah. We see a lady by the name of Anna in Luke 2 and verse 36. And we also see Simeon in Luke 2 and verse 30. And each of these individuals, as soon as they saw Jesus there during the time, after the time of Mary's purification, when they brought Him in to dedicate Him there in the temple, they acknowledged this is the Son of God. Well, we can continue. We see Nicodemus, Nathanael, John the Baptizer, Peter, even Pilate, Pilate's wife, Judas, the centurion, Christ Himself. Time after time, we see people, after having been in the presence of Jesus, they recognized there was something unique about Him. Something special about His character. And most of these individuals came to the conclusion, rightfully, this is the Son of God. Well, let's think about these soldiers for just a moment. What are some of the traits that we see of these men that hold significance to this occasion? Anyone that is here today that has ever served in the military or served in a police force or anything of that nature, one of the things that you are trained is how to observe your surroundings. You watch. You keep an eye on everything that's going on. But also you're trained how to discern what you see taking place. Is this something that's common? Is this something that's normal? Or is this something that I need to pay attention to? Is this drawing my attention for some reason? Well, these soldiers were trained to pick up on the unique. They were trained to focus on those things that might be viewed as a threat, that might be out of the ordinary, that might be something that they need to give extra attention to. Well, they were seeing things here that certainly were unique. They were seeing things that they had never experienced before. But also something that's truly amazing to me in this. Unlike those Jewish leaders who were there, these soldiers' minds were not closed to what was going on. They retained an open mind to the fact that there might be something to what we're seeing. And when they witnessed that, when that evidence was presented to them, as we say today, they called it like they saw it. There was no denying that what the people had been saying about Jesus in a mocking fashion was actually the truth. That He truly is the Son of God. Now, if you look at Luke's account does not have the centurion saying, truly this is the Son of God. Luke's account has, truly this was a righteous man. Now, in either one of those instances, we see this reference to the faith of the individual that was there. Maybe in Luke's account, he's not going so far as to say the Son of God, and maybe some of the crowd was saying this is a righteous man, but they weren't willing to go so far as to say that. But what we know is that those individuals, and right now we're looking just at the soldiers. We'll talk about the rest of the crowd in just a moment. But just the soldiers, they recognized something significant had just happened. And they were afraid. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were the ones that had actually carried out this execution. They were afraid. They didn't know what was going to happen. But as they used their training and their observation and their discernment to consider what was going on, the things that they were witnessing, they came to the conclusion only the power of God could facilitate the things that they were witnessing. But as I said, the centurion was not alone in this realization. Because if we turn over to Luke 23, and let's look at verse 48. Luke 23 and verse 48. And all the people that came, all that came together to that sight, all that came together to witness the crucifixion, beholding the things which were done, smote their breasts and returned. Many of the ones who had accused Jesus, many of those who had stood by mocking Jesus, demanding his crucifixion, stood by watching his death. And this text says that as the earth quaked around them, as they heard all of the commotion going on, as they heard about the veil of the temple being torn, notice it says that they, as a sign of fear, as a sign of grief, as a sign of regret, they stood by beating their chest. Now that's not something that we commonly see in our society today. There's other ways that we display grief. But in that culture and in that society, one of the ways that people showed their grief was to stand there and to beat themselves on the chest. It kind of goes along with this idea of sitting in sackcloth and ashes. You know, it's a sign of great distress, a sign of grief. So not only in this do we see that the centurion and the soldiers that were there with him recognized something significant was going on. Notice it says all of those who had gone to witness the crucifixion. What that tells me is that not everyone that had gone before Pilate went to witness the crucifixion. Once that death sentence had been handed down, I'm sure the high priest went back to his house. I'm sure many of the Sanhedrin probably went on their way. This was not something that people really wanted to witness. They didn't want to witness the actual act being carried out. But notice the text says that all those that went to that site, all those who went to Golgotha, who saw the things that were going on, it says when they saw all of this, they were afraid. They started displaying this sign of grief. They were upset. But I think there's a lot more to be said in the last two words of this verse. Most of our modern English translations have something along the lines of, like the King James says, and returned. Some might say, and returned to their homes. But I think there's a lot more to be said about that. There are a number of ancient translations, very early translations, from the Greek language into the Aramaic language, which was another common language that was spoken in the time of Christ. And in one of those early Aramaic translations, it says this following this scene. It says, "And they went back to their homes, knelt down, and prostrated themselves on the ground." Folks, this is a further sign of that distress, that grief. They recognized, at least some of them recognized on that occasion, we made a mistake. They were afraid. They went home and they tried to humble themselves. They got down on their knees. They laid flat on the ground, displaying this astonishment, this confusion, fear, dread, probably an untold number of emotions. No one had ever witnessed what these people had just witnessed. And if this text, and I believe it is meant to be taken 100% literal in this case, and if this text is meant to be taken literal, then what this says is there was not a single person who was present viewing the crucifixion of Jesus that was not changed in some way. Now, whether they continued on and became followers of Jesus and obeyed the gospel, we don't know that. But when they left that day, they were moved. I think back, and I'm sure most of us, there are a few of you here that are young that may not have much of a memory of this, but you think back to 9/11. And you think back to the days following 9/11. And it seemed like people's minds were turned back to God, were turned back to faith. People were discussing that more and more. Church attendance went up during those days, and there seemed to be a resurgence in interest in God. But then over time, that began to wane. People were moved. They were touched by what they witnessed on that day. Just like those who witnessed those events at Calvary were moved. They were touched. Their emotions were stirred. But not all of them. At least the text doesn't tell us that all of them remained faithful. Yes, ma'am?
Did the curtain tear before Jesus died or after? Because I always thought it did before, and then as I'm reading in Luke that you pointed out, it's making me think that it tore before he died.
You know, one thing that's interesting about the Gospels, some of the Gospel writers don't put things in the same chronological order. And the way that I've often heard it explained is they did it that way because the actual order that those things happened wasn't really what was important. It was simply the whole big picture of what was going on. Now, I typically, at least when John details something, I tend to give a little bit more focus to that because he was actually there. He was present at the crucifixion. What all of these others were being told, yes, it was by inspiration. But those details that they gave, they may not have gave in the exact chronological order because they were just...
And it could have happened all at once.
Right.
It's not that real important. It's just something that...
Right. And I tend to believe that all of these miracles commenced the second Jesus died.
Right.
I don't think that it's something that would have happened prior to that. I think when he cried out with a loud voice, that was signaling, he said, "It is finished. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit."
Right.
I think as soon as he uttered those words and he bowed his head and died, I think that's immediately when the earth began to quake. I think that is when the veil of the temple opened. I think that that's when the graves were opened. I think it's all something that happened immediately at the point that Jesus died. And it's all there as a sign to show the power of God. As one last indication to those there, this is the Son of God. The Son of God has just given his life for you. And as we see with this centurion, I would love to think that he was changed and he went on to become a Christian. I would love to think that. The Bible doesn't tell us that that's the case, but it's certainly possible. But we know that he left that day, him and all of his men that were there, they left changed. Because they witnessed something that they had never seen before.
Do we know geographically how far Calvary was from where the temple was, John?
Well, if you go to Jerusalem today, there's actually conflicting ideas as to exactly where Golgotha was. And what most archaeologists say is that during the Crusades and the other wars that have taken place over Jerusalem, the landscape around Jerusalem has changed so much that the location of Calvary probably doesn't look the same as it did back then, because of all the bombing and all the wars and even all of the expansion of the city. And so there's some that believe that the location of Calvary, we know the Bible tells us that at the time of Christ it was outside of the city gates. Now there's some today that say, well, no, Jerusalem has expanded so much now that it's actually now within the city of Jerusalem. And then there's others that say, well, no, it's still outside of Jerusalem proper. It's still outside of the city. And the interesting thing, there's actually been 2 shrines that have been built in 2 different locations because they really don't know for sure which place it is. I tend to believe, just from what I've studied, that the location that is still outside of Jerusalem, I think that it fits a little bit more with the description that we see in the Bible. But once again, due to just the changes that have happened in the last 2,000 years, it's impossible to ascertain with 100% certainty where that location was.
Well, the reason I asked the question is I wonder, we know that everybody wasn't out at Golgotha at that point. Maybe one of the purposes of that was God giving a sign to everyone that Christ had died, that this was the ending of the old and the beginning of the new, and that even those who were there and saw him may not have seen the veil split. Those that were in the local city probably, I would assume, saw it and heard it, and the earthquake too was a sign to everyone.
That's right. Well, and we're going to see this in the next section that we look at, but what day was this that this took place? It was the day of preparation prior to the Passover Sabbath. The temple would have been filled with people preparing for the Sabbath day. The priests would have been right there in the holy place getting everything prepared for the occasion. The Passover Sabbath was a day when a large number of people would migrate to Jerusalem because there were certain sacrifices that had to be offered on the Passover. And so they had to come to the temple and do that. So Jerusalem would have been filled with people on this day. And so like David was saying, even if they weren't outside the city watching these men being crucified, the earthquake, the veil being torn, the priests came out talking about what had happened. The veil being torn. No, those that came up out of their graves, notice it says they didn't go into the city, but I'm sure they probably heard some commotion going on around the cemeteries. There were all of these signs that even those that weren't there, that didn't witness it themselves, there were still all of these signs there that something significant happened.
You know what's sad about those priests? They knew he was Christ. I believe that they believed that he was Christ. Of course, they were threatened by him. They wanted all this taken care of before all this public.
Well, the Gospels indicate to us that there were many of the priests that believed in him, but that they would not follow him because they didn't want to lose their position or whatever the case may be. So many of them believed that he was the Son of God, but they didn't want to lose their power and their position.
You can relate that to today.
We can. Melinda, did you have a
Now,
question?
is the rending of the veil, is that symbolic of letting the Gentiles have salvation?
I think so, because that veil, that was the separation between God and man. Only the high priest could go through that veil. The Holy of Holies was the one place where God would come down and would meet with the high priest. Well, now that veil has been torn away. The Bible describes our sins as a wall of partition and also a wall of partition between the Gentiles and salvation. Well, that tearing of the veil, as you said, that was symbolic of what was happening. People were going to be able to have a relationship with God that they had never had before. Their sins could be taken away. We are in the presence of God right now. There is not a holy of holies in one certain place that we have to go to. We're in the presence of God all the time because that veil has been torn away. And as referenced, the testator, the book of Hebrews talks about that a new covenant or a new testament cannot come into effect until the death of the testator. Well, at the death of the testator, that sign of the covenant with the Jews was torn away. They had rejected it, yes.
They wanted a material king.
That's right.
They wanted coming in riches and glory and making a big hoopla.
They wanted someone to come in and drive the Romans out. They wanted their nation restored back to them. And so that's what they thought the Messiah was going to be. They didn't think he was going to be a spiritual king. No, they were expecting someone to come with great pomp and pride, and that wasn't Jesus. That wasn't Jesus.
Well, I know that a lot of people, and it would be an honor to get to go to Jerusalem and walk where Jesus walked.
It would be,
But
yes.
that's something that we really need to focus on being on our bucket list because, like you said, everything's changed. You wouldn't really be where he was, and that country is war-torn.
It is. And, like you said, it's something that I would love to go see sometime. It's something that I think would be an amazing trip to go and see some of those things. But if I never make it there, it's not going to keep me out of heaven. If I never make it there, it's not going to be the end of the world. But it's one of those things that, things have changed a lot. They've gone in and they've built shrines or churches, or even there's some Islamic mosques that have been built on significant Christian sites. And it's a dangerous place to go. But if people want to go there, if they have the means to go there, I think it's a great trip, something great for people to be able to do. But it's not something that's going to change us or have any direct impact upon our faith by being able to go and do that. And it goes back to what I said before. Part of the old law was pilgrimage. They had to go to the temple. They had to go and offer sacrifices. They had to do certain things. Other religions today, Islam, they are expected to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least one time in their life. That's the birthplace of Muhammad. That's their main holy city. They're expected to make that pilgrimage at least one time. I think the Hindus, they're expected to make pilgrimages to certain locations in India at least once in their life. So you see this concept of holy places, holy locations, is something that was a part of this old system of law. It was a part of the law of Moses. They had to go to Jerusalem at certain times for certain things, but we don't have to do that anymore. That's not a part of this new covenant. We don't have to go to Jerusalem and actually kneel at the site of the cross. We don't have to do that. We don't have to go and visit the Garden of Gethsemane. You can if you want to. That location's known. You don't have to go and actually stand at the tomb of Jesus. Once again, that's one of those areas where there's differing ideas as to where it's at. There's 2 or 3 different locations that's possibilities. But that is not how faith is set up under the new covenant. It's not based upon those physical things. It's based upon our observance of the will of God.
John, I don't see him writing anything about the tearing of the...
Yeah, John's gospel, so much of it is more succinct in detail. And we have to understand as well that the Gospels were written to different audiences initially. And so like Matthew was written mainly to a Jewish audience. And so that's why we see Matthew focusing so much upon fulfilled prophecy. Because those he was writing to, that would hold a lot of significance. That's why Matthew includes the genealogy of Jesus right at the very beginning, because that was important to the Jews. We look at the Gospel of Luke. Luke was written to a Greek audience, a group that was considered more scholarly in their understanding and in their abilities of discernment. That's why we see Luke going into so much technical detail that we don't see in the other gospel writers. Mark was written mainly to a Roman audience, and they didn't really care at all about the Jewish aspects of it. They just wanted to know the details about Jesus. And so that's why Mark is not as detailed on the Jewish aspects and the prophecies. And with John, John does not detail as much of the early ministry of Jesus. He focuses more so upon the later time. And I tend to believe the reason that was because he was the only actual eyewitness among the apostles to the crucifixion. And so he devoted more of his writing to the things concerning that period of time. All right, we're going to stop right there. We're out of time. Lord willing, next Sunday morning we'll pick up at Matthew 27 and verse 55.